Hello, my name's Jonathan Gunter, and I have been doing a PhD study for the previous 7 years, which has been based in a Communities First area in South Wales. Communities First was a community regeneration programme which launched in the year 2000, and I was a volunteer and I worked there. And over the following slides, I'm going to explain to you the findings of my PhD thesis. So as I say, Communities First was initially a 10-year regeneration plan, which was based in Wales's most deprived communities. And that was based on the Wales Index of Multiple Deprivation, which was a governmental index which monitored a range of figures and issues with regard to poverty and social exclusion within Wales. So Communities First was reflective of a lot of policy of the era, triggered in the New Labour years, since the New Labour came into power in 1997. And in England, there was the New Deal for Communities, which was a flagship regeneration programme which worked in many different areas across England. And in Wales, Communities First was launched across 142 different areas of multiple disadvantage. As the years went on, this number extended to 179 different areas of multiple disadvantage. And basically there would be teams that were employed by Communities First, which was a government funded programme, and these teams would often involve a coordinator, a development worker and an administrator, sometimes more staff, and they would work within an area, always based in that area. Well, at the start it was anyway, and they would develop partnership groups, and the idea would be that there were these partnerships that met up that involved members of the statutory sector, members of the voluntary sector and members of the community sector, so members of the community, and they would form these partnerships, and these partnerships would conduct audits of the needs of their area, and through a process of kind of working towards these issues, they would seek to redress some of the issues of disadvantage and poverty within the areas that they worked. And these partnership groups, I studied one in South Wales, and they had the impact of, well, the intention of working for the benefit of these of the actual communities, and the idea would be that they bring statutory powers in and services, the charitable sector, and also be able to bridge some of the gaps and link communities and services in a more joined up and effective way. So I looked at a particular partnership, which was a subgroup of these local partnership groups, which was primarily concerning work with young people in an area of disadvantage, which was the area that I worked, and that was called the Youth Action Group, or YAG for short. And so the research question for my PhD thesis is, what impact has the Communities First partnership approach had on youth services and the lives of young people in areas of multiple disadvantage? I took an ethnographic approach and conducted participant observation and interviews. So I attended the meetings for about 18 months. I'd actually been attending them for many years before that, when the actual group started in 2006. But I attended 18 months and recorded notes and recorded the audio of the Youth Action Group meetings. And I also conducted interviews with various partners that attended the meetings. So members of the statutory sector, some from the local authority, the council, some from the voluntary sector, and some residents and community members. I also conducted participant observation of youth clubs in the area, and as well as observing youth clubs, I conducted about 6 interviews with young people as well. So in this next slide, I would like to introduce to you and describe to you a little bit about the actual meetings themselves. Well, these youth action group meetings took place once per month, and generally they were about a 2-hour meeting. They usually take place on a Monday morning. It started at about 10 o'clock. Within those meetings, we may discuss things like funding, progress and updates. And there'll be external visitors from other organisations that may come along, such as Network Rail, the Prince's Trust, and other third sector charities, as well as regular members that attended as well. And within there would be discussion of there was kind of like a general expected meeting schedule that would start with a review of the previous welcome and apologies, a review of the previous month's minutes, and then there would sometimes be discussion points regarding maybe upcoming events such as Halloween events or the Christmas period or the summer period, and different partners around the table would discuss what provision that they have in the area. And it was a way of kind of joining up and discussing the provision jointly in the area and what delivery was taking place, so that organisations were able to kind of draw on and maximise the chance of at least having some form of Halloween coverage during, say, evenings of antisocial behaviour and fireworks night, so that kind of things were covered and that services were being delivered effectively in the area, or to as much as possible given the constraints of the resources available. So over the next several slides, I'm going to introduce you the findings of my thesis, and they will be broken down into 3 key areas. Firstly, I'll focus on the functions of the meetings. I'll then go on to explain about the impact of the Youth Action Group and these meetings on the area's networks. And following this, finally, I'll discuss the impact of the meetings and the impact of its networks on processes of marginalisation within the area. Okay, so firstly, in terms of focusing on the functions of the actual meetings themselves, there were a number of different functions that the Youth Action Group could be seen to offer for partners that attended those meetings. And one of those examples would be support and advice. So partners could offer support and advice, saying if there were difficulties with funding and things like that. Sometimes more experienced partners could get advice from less experienced partners, those kind of from the community sector that were running like clubs or local youth groups that maybe struggled with funding or struggle getting access to services, could benefit from the service providers that were there at the table, because they could find out more about what could be delivered in the area. On top of that, there was an opportunity for networking and information exchange, so getting information, as I say, about funding, networking, meeting others, finding out about, say, substance misuse support agencies, getting to work programs, organisations such as Careers Wales to direct young people towards jobs. So there was kind of that level of crossover and opportunity to network different service providers with members of the community. There was also opportunity to plan and manage the area's services. For example, there may be summer events coming up, say if the Youth Action Group was taking place in April and May, or Halloween events taking place, or Christmas, and opportunities for, say, the discussion of making sure that there was provision in the area over the summer period, so that young people weren't, say, bored or they had things to do over the summer holidays, which would of course be good because it gave young people something to do, but also kind of help to provide a way of not provide an opportunity for young people to congregate and gather and maybe cause nuisance behaviour because their time is being fulfilled and used in a positive and creative way. Opportunity to manage the area services as well in terms of coordinating for say a Halloween event. Different organisations could kind of commit to different provisions that they're delivering, and there would be an understanding between them of what's actually taking place at the time. There was also opportunity to challenge other partners and raise concerns. For example, one time Tom, who's a service provider from the third sector, the voluntary sector, and he actually raised a complaint about a police officer that hadn't turned up to a summer event. They delivered this summer event and the police weren't there, and so Tom raised it in the meeting, why on earth weren't the PCSOs there, to which they said that it was difficult because the Olympics were on in the centre and therefore it was difficult to get numbers there. But then in following events, PCSO presence at some of the events being delivered had increased. So it just goes to show how the Youth Action Group provided almost like a safe place to raise challenges, a constructive place to raise challenges. Okay, so one of these examples above functions of the meetings being support, I've got a quotation here taken during one of the meetings. Liam, who said he was a practitioner, say a fairly junior level practitioner, was speaking to the group and said, I'm finding it difficult running the youth club. I've had problems with behaviour, young people smoking drugs in the toilets, and there being difficulty kicking off, to which Kathleen said, yes, Kathleen was the local authority youth worker that worked in the local authority youth centre, and she said, yes, it's hard, I work with a lot of those kids. You need to have patience and don't be afraid to show discipline. For some of these kids, a youth club is their first port of call for integration into society, so they need to learn how to behave in the real world. And really this idea from Kathleen that, well, she was providing advice to Liam, and all these different partners around the table could not only learn about maybe the issues that service providers were having, and therefore Communities First staff may be able to bring support in or bring training to equip some of the more junior level or leaders of community groups that might not have that backing that those with full-time roles did have. And also the opportunity for more experienced partners and those with more formal backgrounds perhaps to be able to give advice and support. Okay, so I've explained a little bit about the impact of the YAG in terms of the functions of the YAG and what actually took place within the meetings. But now I'd like to go on and explain the impact of the meetings on the meetings, say outside of the meetings. So I take this first quote, which is from Communities First development worker Lauren, who said, a lot of the time we're in our little silos, but by bringing people together, you see you've got all the same issues and challenges. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but we're like a family now with lots of really strong relationships. And really what Lauren is saying is that different partners used to whereas they used to operate in isolation, and you may get leaders of community groups or leaders of the Cub and Scout groups of various clubs and different organisations in the area that weren't really working together. They were working in an isolated way. There was definitely a step forward in terms of how partners work together, how different organisations could kind of operate, and she likened that to the process of being like a family, and that process can be likened to what Putnam refers to as social capital, and specifically bonding capital, which refers to in-group social ties, and certainly being considered as a family could be likened to processes of bonding social capital. And also another point from John, who said the strength of the YAG is that network. The work doesn't happen in the meetings. It's a meeting, yeah, but most of the meeting happens outside of it. The group that comes together is just a mechanism to formally communicate and to have people in agreement around a table. But actually the nuts and bolts of the work do not happen around that table. They happen with organisations emailing each other and working together. And this point here from John is kind of explaining that members of the YAG, really the YAG acted as a symbolic impact to bring partners together, but really the main work was outside of the meetings, when they actually were more likely to, say, visit each other's venues, to work jointly on projects and different things like that. And so what happened in the meetings is it brought partners together, but then that created a network of service providers outside of the meetings. And the fact that it brought different partners together can be likened to processes of bridging social capital, which is something that Robert Putnam refers to. And so we see here we've got examples of both bonding and bridging social capital taking place. So building on this idea of networks, I've put together a network diagram of the services in the area before the Youth Action Group in 2007. And here this network diagram is shows mainly the services being delivered in Muddock, one area. There weren't really so many services delivered in other areas of the city. And there weren't that many, and generally they were in Muddock. Now, several years later, in 2012, 2013, which was the year of the field work, you can see that there's a greater number of services that were delivered. Now, some of these were actually organisations that were encouraged as a result of the increases in funding available due to Communities First and other organisations funding and supporting the growth of third sector, voluntary sector, youth organisations, and organisations that delivered with crossover with young people. But also other organisations, as I say, that delivered events that could also be attended by young people. So Communities First held the Local Heroes Awards, which was an event which took place once a year, but young people were open to attend. There were also lots of summer activity fun days delivered in the area, and many different activities and things like that. So there was a greater number of services delivered in the area, but in addition to that greater number, there's also a broader diversity of services delivered in the area, a broader diversity of organisations, their backgrounds, say statutory, third sector, community groups, with a greater range of people delivering, and also a greater geographical, also in terms of diversity, a greater range of services being delivered. For example, there would be generic open youth clubs with, say, table tennis and pool, and then there'd be more specific activities in other clubs, such as sport clubs or music clubs for young people to pursue their interests and careers in music and recording studio activities. And so what you can see here is, because there was this overall net of a wider diversity of organisations and wider diversity of people and the backgrounds they represented involved in the delivery of services, there was a wider diversity of services and activities young people could become involved in, wider diversity in the ethos and the makeup and the nature of these services, and just general addition to the diversity. There was also a wider geographical spread, as can be seen here, which can be partly be understood by different organisations trying to find their niches in the area and to develop niches as they worked. And also there was a greater connectedness between services, which, as the previous two slides ago shows, as a result of kind of partners meeting within the meetings, they were more likely to work with each other outside of the meetings. Okay, so the next slide I would like to draw upon, which looks at the unique roles of partners across the YAG network. So we've got this idea of like this youth action group network within the perceptions of different partners that had attended the group and were service providers in the area. And we've also got some perceptions from interview data of different partners' unique roles within that network. So voluntary youth worker and resident Tom said, where we have relied on communities first, they have relied on us. They need us to tell them what's going on. They are one step removed. They support us to do stuff in the community, and they rely on us to tell them what the problems are. We had a barbecue in the community garden, and we invited our Roma young people, but we also invited their families, and that was crucial information for them. And so really what Tom is saying here is that, yes, Communities First offered support to us, frontline staff and practitioners, but they were kind of one step removed from the links within the community. And this is where some of the residents who crossed over with being voluntary sector youth workers had a real kind of unique strength to add to the YAG, because they could actually engage with these harder reach groups because they had closer ties with them and spent more time there. And those unique links, they could then use that to obtain information from this client group, which then, say, more formal organisations from the local authority, from Communities First, could act upon in order to steer funding to be able to better serve the needs of residents of the area. So going on to the next point now about Communities First development worker Lauren, we can turn this example on its head by saying not only were there unique strengths offered by those on the ground level to the youth action group, i.e. upwards, but also there were those in more formal and statutory positions that could provide links to more formal and professional bodies that could be better for grassroots service providers and young people and service receivers themselves. So the quote here from Lauren is that important people are more likely to come into the area and are more interested in providing funding. The National Theatre liked the sound of the things that Lakeside Youth Group were doing, and they said bring them down to a performance. Things like this are achieved through having conversations. So the more activity we do as Communities First with people, and the more constant this is, the more other organisations will be, oh, we can help with this, or we have got more funding, how can we get involved? So really the point here Lauren is making is that they almost acted as advocates for the area, and Communities First could have these different conversations with different staff in different areas, and having those different conversations would serve as a way to kind of bring other people about and kind of bring other organisations with quite big opportunities into the area to divert funding. It's almost like joining up the gaps. And so really this idea of the YAG as a network, the YAG could be seen as almost a kind of junction that brings different groups and different strengths of different connections together. So we got this overall kind of entangling and mixing of different individuals and groups, strengths from different sectors. Okay, so I'm now going to present the next part of my talk. We've spoken about number one, which was the functions of the meetings and looking at the meetings and themselves, what they serve to provide, and then we went on to look at the impact of the youth action group on networks in terms of different partners' perceptions of the youth action group as a network, bringing different partners together, and also that network existing outside of the confines of the meetings. We then went to have a look at the change in the number of services in the area and the expanded YAG network that was kind of more diverse, greater in number, greater in connectedness, and the net effect that had in terms of the youth action group being a junction with different partners within the youth action group being able to offer different strengths to that overall network in terms of what they could bring to the table. So next, I'm going to focus on the impact of the youth action group on young people themselves, on the services and young people themselves. But first, I'd like to give you some examples of some of young people's processes of marginalisation before I explain the impact of the youth action group on processes of marginalisation as experienced by young people. Okay, so firstly, Alyssa, who said, I was arrested and the police officers took me back to the station and were mean to me. I was crying and I was in a cell on my own, and the police officer ripped a nail off my finger and said, if you don't shut up, I'll rip them all off. To which youth worker Ellie replied, surely you can complain about that because that's just not right. To which Alyssa then said, because my surname has a bad reputation with the police, she was being especially mean. And in Alyssa's perceptions, because she was a well-known family in the area, that with a surname was well known by police officers and different kind of statutory roles, with maybe uncles and aunties that had gone into prison and that. Alyssa certainly felt that they expected her to be representative of that family, and she felt that gave her a level of stigma that then went on to almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of that bad reputation affecting how she was treated by the police as well. Okay, so our next point is about a course that some young people went to a university day on one day, and then there was a course going on over a few weeks, and I explained to the lads that course was starting on Saturday, and were they up for it? It would look really good on their CV. One of them replied, where is it? I explained, just up the road, to which Charlie replied, yeah, but the thing is, Joff, you've got to understand those places aren't for people like us. And really, Charlie was getting the point across that even though a university was just a mile away from his house, he didn't feel that universities were supposed to be for people like him that came from that community, and really quite a strong point about, the divisions in terms of what young people felt entitled to attend. The next point is from Sean, who in a recording studio session said, do you want to buy a BlackBerry tablet? The youth worker said, why would I want to buy a BlackBerry tablet? Where did you get that from? And he said, I nicked them from the shopping centre. You just pull 2 tabs off of the back and you can sell them to get trainers and smoke. And the youth worker said, you should find legitimate ways of getting money. To which Sean replied, yeah, right, like collecting Skittles or doing a paper round. And basically what Sean was saying is that there really wasn't a realistic way for him to legitimately get money, because trainers and small drugs are a lot more expensive than the money that he could legitimately be perceived to generate, such as collecting Skittles or doing a paper round, and therefore he had no choice to turn to crime in order to be able to afford things like trainers. Okay, so now that I've conveyed some of these points regarding the experiences of marginalisation that young people faced in terms of their perceptions of marginalisation, I'd now like to explain some counterpoints which can be surfaced from the youth services that young people received, and how I argue that the Youth Action Group supported some of these challenges to these barriers. Okay, so firstly, Alyssa, who said, sometimes with your friends in school you argue, but here it's a different kind of social circle. Like, you don't know any of them, so none of these people can judge you. Like, they don't know your background, and then you get to know each other and they get to understand where you're coming from. And Alyssa here was describing a music club that she went to, and basically she there was kind of the mainstream local authority youth services, and they generally get the generic young people, the mainstream young people, like maybe the in groups from the local high school that would go to that. And there were these other clubs that existed that maybe other young people could kind of explore about. Maybe they didn't get on well with the friends at some of the other youth clubs and find their own niches. And Alyssa's saying that, some of these clubs you could go to, and because she didn't really know them, they didn't know her background, and she was less likely to be judged by her background, and that would almost give her a clean slate to which she could develop her personality without such a stigma of labelling. Okay, so the next point is from Connor, who said, we started coming here, which was Lakeside Youth Centre, and doing music. We did showcases and the thing we used to do with you, by the tennis court, and that show in the leisure centre with Getz, and that's where we met Mike, and he introduced us to Justin and his group. Then Justin introduced us to Kevin, manager of a youth organisation in a neighbouring city, and took us under his wing, and then things picked up. We were doing schools tours and shows in London. And Connor's really conveying the fact that, well, he described it as a music scene, and that even though they were youth services within an area, such as Lakeside, where they learnt about recording and learnt about making their own raps, and the things that my organisation used to deliver in terms of youth music events, they felt as if that there was a scene that they could attend to and be a part of, and that led on to them finding some recording studio opportunities in Newport, well, in the nearby city, and that led on to them becoming involved with Sky TV's Must Be the Music, and then going on to doing tours in London and different shows. So just going to show in terms of Connor's perspective, this kind of almost connectedness of different services in the area having an impact on young people's experiences could then lead almost onto stepping stones for young people to progress. Okay, another point from Paul. Paul was a young person that turned up to a youth club once a week. He had a go at DJing and learning how to DJ at the youth club. And he said he wouldn't have got a gig unless he had come and did DJing. And then I found out about the trip Josh was putting on, and then when I got to know Josh, he found out about what I was doing, and he asked me to DJ at the primary school. And so what Paul's saying here is that when he was at the club, he found out about a trip through Josh at Communities First. He went on the trip, Josh learned that he was DJing, and then he went to give Paul an opportunity to DJ in the local primary school. And so we've almost got this connection between one youth club and then a youth worker, a Communities First development worker who was linked through there being this overall network of service provision in the area. And then on top of that, he could go on and DJ, so there was these opportunities in other areas for him. Another similar point from Adam, who said, I think the first people outside of the youth club was Josh from Communities First. They were the next step up the ladder. When Josh came to a meeting with me, he said, Adam is a good lad, and he has been doing this and has been doing that and working for Communities First, and we're supporting him in the project. They just basically backed me up, if you know what I mean. I can't think of a way to word it. It's the same as having a letter of support. And what Adam's saying here is that really the youth workers gave Adam a level of support, and he appreciated that, but he almost had a perceived professional career pathway to which people outside of the youth clubs, as he perceived it, were these kind of people in more professional roles, such as the staff members of Communities First. And as he got to know those, he went to some meetings to run an event, and by him having an endorsement from these people in professional roles, that did a lot for his confidence, because it felt like he was having backup and almost a letter of support is how he describes it. And so for Adam, his perception is that this kind of link to this backup was something that kind of strengthened him, and really can be countered with the previous slides examples of, say, someone like Alyssa saying, as a result of the background they were from, they were treated unfairly. Here we've got someone being treated with extra support because of where they're from, because of this youth action group network that exists. Another example I'd like to provide is from Lauren, the Communities First development worker, who said different staff on different projects in different places shows young people they can have access to these different services too. It sets a precedent and breaks down barriers, like the YMCA project in Newtown and Muddock. So the YMCA project was actually funded by the local authority youth service, and the funding was received by the YMCA, but it was to deliver these services within different play centres within the area. So one in Willsmead and one in Planwelly. And for a long time it had been considered that there was this black bridge that linked Llanwelly and Muddock, and that young people didn't really cross that. That was a big thing to cross because there was known rivalry between young people in Newtown and young people in Muddock. And so this project that delivered actually involved young people and youth workers that were delivering in the one play centre, which was in Newtown, and it involves staff from the local authority youth centre Lakeside and also staff from YMCA. And young people who had predominantly worked with the staff at Lakeside Youth Centre learnt that these staff were going to the YMCA, and then they felt that they had the onus to go on and go over the Black Bridge to work in the Newtown Play Centre. And also young people that were going to provisions in Newtown with clubs that were specifically set up by Newtown Communities First in order to develop provision, then found that there was the need for extra support because they could go to Lakeside. And so young people who were only really ever turning up to Newtown felt that they had the confidence and opportunity to go on to Lakeside Communities First and Lakeside Youth Centre. So we've got that overall crossing taking place, and there isn't really known a division now that exists in the area. So one division that did exist before has fizzled out, and that's been something like 7 years now in the making. Okay, so I'd like to explain another example of how the Youth Action Group provided a network of stepping stones to support young people. And this example involves the local Roma young people. Many families had moved in 2003 and 2004 into the area as a result of European laws being relaxed on the numbers of Roma that could move, or the number of borders and people crossing borders within Europe and the EU. And there were increased numbers of Roma within the area, and they were very difficult to engage with, as was considered by the local authority youth service. And on here, the diagram U is where there was a music club set up, and a lot of Roma actually turned up to that music club. So there was then a funded provision that was funded by the youth service, which was delivered in Llanwelly, and a lot of Roma went to that. And that led to them going to another youth club, which was delivered by the YMCA, which is K, and that led to them going on to pursue, some of them anyway, pursue interest in music and go into an engaged club in which they would work in music and recording studios and things like that, to which there were other native local British young people, Welsh young people, as well as the Roma. And so the fact that they were already hooked and engaged and had opportunities and activities to pursue meant that they got involved with those activities. One young person in a survey from the provision in W said that they didn't like to go to Willsmead because they found that the young people there were racist and started fights. But as A and Y and V show, that young people actually went to these other provisions. That there were basically summer fun days that were delivered, and one fun day delivered in Willsmead, which was sponsored by Network Rail, and a lot of young people from there actually went to those youth clubs. Okay, so I've explained a bit about firstly the functions of the Youth Action Group, and I then went on to discuss the Youth Action Group in terms of its impact on networks. And following that, I went on to explain how the Youth Action Group network provided opportunities for progression for young people. But now I'm going to start to bring the presentation to a close with some reflections on really the significance of these findings in relation to wider structural forces of inequality in society. yes, the youth action group might improve services, but what difference does that improvement make to the lives of young people in areas of disadvantage? Well, one particular source of research is Dale and Newman, 2008, who argue social capital may provide some counterweight to economic and social disadvantage. And there is a great deal of partnership work out there, also Ballack and Taylor, 2010, who argue that social capital, those processes of social capital will be able to kind of counter some of the negative effects of area-based poverty that young people experience. And others, on the other hand, argue that partnerships can ameliorate some of the negative consequences of poverty, but only changes to the working class base and foundational economy will achieve any meaningful impact on poverty in Wales. And so the point here is that Adam's saying that the foundational economy it really needs to change, and that really partnerships can ameliorate some of the process of negative consequences of poverty, but we need these wider level changes to take place in order to have any meaningful and significant impact on poverty, which is a good point. However, this doesn't take away from the fact that there were many positive impacts on young people, and events held and accreditations delivered and engagements and many positive success stories. And really I'd like to bring the talk to a close with this understanding of kind of a comparison between macro and micro understandings of the impact of services, because yes, their structural inequality exists, but youth services can still be a valuable force for good in young people's lives. Partnerships such as the YAG can have a strong impact on the delivery of services, which can counter some processes of inequality. So we need to move away from a dichotomous view of services towards a more nuanced understanding of their impact on networks at the community level. We need to recognise that influencing these micro processes are integral to the wider picture, so must not be undervalued. And really the point here is that yes, micro level processes such as partnerships as the Youth Action Group can have impacts on people at the local level. They can't kind of solve the UK's poverty issue. There's many wider complex issues at stake. However, they can have some tangible difference on the lives of young people and an impact on services. And so we need to look at them and understand services within that way, because it's perhaps those little micro steps that can build towards a macro picture. And so I'd like to bring your attention to some of the things that can undermine the significance and impact of the Youth Action Group over time, such as adding other areas to the Youth Action Group, top-down changes which can undermine fragile networks that exist, such as imposed by the local authority, adding other areas to the group's remit, resurfacing divisions. So sometimes there would be a conflict that came up one time between Lakeside communities, Lakeside Youth Centre and Muddock Communities First, and then the different staff were getting territorial with the young people that they work with. One community member said it's not fair, it's all gone up in the air, and it's not fair on the kids because they're missing out on services because the staff are becoming territorial and defensive over the people that they work with and the young people that they work with. And really over time, it's about understanding that the Youth Action Group is this network, like a delicate, fragile network, a junction of these different community members and sectors of service provision that, when joined, can have their most beneficial impact on ameliorating processes of poverty and providing opportunities for learning and understanding for young people's progression and development. However, naturally, with policy changes at a maybe a central government level, changes in terms of funding, environmental circumstances, and also changes over time regarding resurfacing divisions, changes over time with regard to austerity and fluctuations in government funds available and other environmental things. These connections become undermined, and obviously the great obvious one is that a young person 1 year, 15 years later, isn't going to be the same young person. There'll be new young people in the area, and so there's this constant regeneration and cycle of connections and networks that exist. And so rather than looking at it as throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we should understand these network catalysts, as it were, that support networks that can be most conducive to strengthening services, should not be regarded as something that are a failure because they don't overcome poverty, but instead they should be regarded as an entity that should be continually maintained and protected over time and over generations in order to maximize the gains that they can be regarded as successful in achieving. And that there is a strength in the finding of these networks that I argue we should not knowingly undermine and dismiss, because coupled with other developments in services and wider policy interventions, can be part of the builder box of building a stronger and more cohesive society. So I'd just like to thank you for listening to this talk, and ask if you have any questions. Undermine and dismiss, because coupled with other developments in services and wider policy interventions, can be part of the builder box of building a stronger and more cohesive society. So I'd just like to thank you for listening to this talk, and ask if you have any questions.